All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Tyler Fornes. I'm a manager of what's called Global Incident Response here at Expel. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Defender for Endpoint specifically. We're going to start by going through some ransomware details. We're going to talk a little bit about what ransomware really kind of looks like when you're dealing with it live in the moment. We're going to talk a lot about Defender for Endpoint and all the great things that it does, and a little bit about how we use it here at Expel. And then we're going to dive into a real ransomware incident that we've actually experienced here at Workbench to talk a little bit about how we've kind of augmented that capability and what we can do next to kind of proactively respond to ransomware when it's happening. So again, my name is Tyler Fornes. I'm a Global Incident Response Manager here at Expel. Basically, how you can think about that is any of the critical incidents that we have here at Expel, I lead a team of incident responders that are going to be responsible for going and figuring out the who, what, where, when, why of that incident and helping you as a customer respond to that incident in real time. Now, again, today, what we're going to talk about, we're first going to talk about ransomware. We're going to talk a little bit about what ransomware actually looks like in 2021 and some of the trends that we're seeing. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's great about Defender for Endpoint, meaning what are the things that Defender for Endpoint does really well that helps us with ransomware response. I'm going to show you how we thought about our integration and exactly what we did to kind of fine-tune our Defender for Endpoint integration to make our analysts a little harder, better, faster, stronger when we're dealing with Defender for Endpoint. And then at the last about 20, 30 minutes of this talk, we're going to actually jump into what we call Workbench at Expel, meaning the portal that you would use as a customer to kind of understand what our analysts are doing day in and day out when we're using Defender for Endpoint and what real ransomware response looks like in the moment and how we've augmented Defender for Endpoint to help us be really proactive and really thorough with that response. So all that being said, let's talk about ransomware really quick, and let's just go over some very high-level things about ransomware that make it really hard to respond to. So first and foremost, responding to ransomware in real time is super challenging. I put here hours or minutes and minutes or seconds. And really what I mean by that is that the timeline to remediation for ransomware has to be much quicker than we normally deal with other incidents. Meaning when we deal with something like a hands-on keyboard attacker and when we deal with something a little bit more critical in the cloud, such as like an AWS root key exposure, there's remediation that we can do right away that kind of gets the attacker out. But when we're dealing with ransomware, we're dealing with something that has usually an automatic propagation method. We're dealing with the destruction and the encryption of files. There's things that are being done at every second by that automation that are making our response more challenging as we go. And I put here, you got to go fast, but you also have to be right. And with that being said, what we really need to optimize for when we're dealing with ransomware is we got to be able to proactively identify where the ransomware is in the environment. We have to identify what type of ransomware and what capability it is. But we also have to go back and understand where the ransomware actually came from to make sure that once we're done with remediation, it doesn't happen again. All of that takes a lot of time to figure out. And there's a lot of data that goes along with that to be able to answer that question correctly. So in order to be fast and right, what do we have to do and what technology do we need to build to go help us get to that? We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. Now, down at the bottom here, one of the biggest challenges that we deal with day in and day out with ransomware is as the encryption continues, forensics become harder to pull. And what I mean by that is as we continue to see ransomware destroy an environment, as it continues to destroy Windows and Linux hosts and ransom all of the files that might be on a machine, there are strains of ransomware that actually go after some of the forensics that are useful to us as responders. And with that being said, as the encryption continues and as we take longer and longer to respond, it actually becomes harder to respond as we go because we can't answer some of those key investigative questions without a lot of work and without hoping that we can decrypt those files to help tell us the answers. And so with all that being said, we need tools that get us answers quickly. We don't have a lot of time to actually spend doing some of the more manual forensics that are traditional ways of dealing with a breach. But with ransomware, we actually have to start proactively asking some of these questions as we identify the ransomware to be able to start answering the questions that we need to be right about what exactly is going on in the environment. So all that being said, some of the things that we start doing, and when we start thinking about ransomware at Expel, it's actually quite a big problem that we deal with. And we see a lot of ransomware here at Expel, but not really in the way that you might think. I've put here in the middle that 12% of incidents over the past couple of months could have led to a ransomware incident. And what I mean by that is when we think about how we actually detect and respond to ransomware at scale across our customer base, we're really optimizing for the early signs of ransomware deployment. We don't really want to start worrying about static indicators of files being encrypted. Obviously, that's a part of our detection strategy that still exists, but we want to hyper optimize for what does it look like when ransomware enters an environment, and what are the signs of deployment of ransomware so that we can actually get ahead of stopping it before it even has the chance to run its encryption routine. So with all that being said, thanks to products like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, we can start to get ahead of this because Defender for Endpoint allows us to have all of the data and all of the signal that we need to hyper optimize for the deployment of ransomware. And if you look on the right side of the screen here, we have a blog that kind of talks about some of the things that we normally see when we see ransomware being deployed, and also kind of how we think about what those signs mean and how we respond next. We're going to dig into this a little bit more in the later parts of the presentation, but this is really where Defender for Endpoint shines. Because when it comes to ransomware response and how we use Defender to help us out, there's a lot of really great features that allow us to get really, really good at dealing with something like ransomware. So first and foremost, we talked about this a little bit already, is prioritizing for the signs of delivery, meaning what are the signs that the ransomware has entered the environment and is about to encrypt the host. If we can have really good telemetry there, and if we can start to identify some of those signs, we can get ahead of this before it becomes a really big newsworthy problem. The next thing is optimizing for the next steps, meaning once we've identified a host that may be attempted to be infected or has become infected, what are the next things that our responders are going to need to do to be able to answer the questions that get us to remediation? So what is the data that they're going to need? What are the steps that they're going to need to be able to take? And what are the things that they're going to need to be able to do their job to be able to remediate this effectively? There's a lot of data that goes along with this, and there's a lot of data that we're going to need to pull to be able to tell that story definitively and be able to answer some very key investigative questions to allow us to get to total remediation. And then last but not least, easily performing the remediation. Do we have a platform that allows us to, at scale, deal with something like ransomware? We're going to talk about this in a second, where Defender for Endpoint does this very, very well. So first and foremost, let's dive into prioritizing the signs of delivery a little bit more. Now, prioritize the leads that are signs of deployment of ransomware, not the ransom itself. When we talk about this at Expel, and when we kind of build the data that kind of tells this story, what we're really looking for is we're looking for signs of commodity malware deployment. Now, obviously, not all ransomware propagates in the same way that commodity malware does. There's a little bit more to it than that. But a lot of the signs that we're seeing of ransomware being deployed across our customer overlap with how commodity malware deploys. And obviously, commodity malware is something that we all deal with every single day, probably sometimes even hundreds of times a week. But the signs are there and the data is there in this graph that you see on the right, that there's a huge overlap in how this stuff actually propagates. And you can see here how you can read this graph is this is the number of incidents that we've seen over the last quarter here at Expel, where ransomware was attempted to be deployed, broken out by the MITRE attack technique that this was actually attempted to be deployed with. You can see here, user execution kind of takes the top of the chart, following along with command and scripting interpreters, meaning things like command shell, PowerShell, JavaScript, WScript, all the things that go along with that. And then down at the bottom here, we see things like replication through removable media and browser extensions. All of these things at some point require user input, and they also share the ways in which we see some of our more common commodity malware techniques being deployed. When we think about things like user execution, that's going to be things where a user has interacted with the file and double-clicked it and attempted it for it to run. Now, we see a lot of that when people download weird third-party extensions or weird third-party applications from the internet, or maybe even something like a maldoc, where someone was phished and was able to download a document that had some kind of code on the back end that allowed a payload to be downloaded and executed. Those are really big things that we deal with, and probably the biggest way in which we see ransomware attempt to propagate. Second, command and scripting interpreter. This is going to be things that you see I have listed out over here on the left, like command, PowerShell, Microsoft Office, HTA, JavaScript, and unmanaged PowerShell. Those are all ways in which we see commodity malware be deployed and attempted to be executed. This is also a reasonable way in which we see ransomware go through this. And when we talk about the ways in which Defender for Endpoint does a lot of its detection, it's hyper optimized for finding these things, and the detection is there to help us identify when a scripting interpreter is being launched from an abnormal application, or if there's weird PowerShell or something on like unmanaged PowerShell being run on the box to let us know that some kind of obfuscation technique is being used or something weird is being done in the terms of how that PowerShell is being executed. A really great indicator there. So all that to be said, really what I want you to take away from this slide in itself is that commodity malware is tough to deal with, but commodity malware shares a lot of the ways in which we see ransomware being propagated and delivered to a host. And that means that these things share a lot of the same indicators and share a lot of the same techniques. These alerts are very important, and Defender does a really good job of giving us these initial leads to move into the next stages of our investigation. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about here that's definitely a major pain point for a lot of organizations, and also another way in which we see ransomware being propagated, is the exploitation of public-facing applications. You can see that's our third biggest type of techniques that we've seen ransomware be deployed with. Now, what that means is that's going to be something like a web server sitting on the internet that maybe has an old application that has a CVE or some kind of zero-day waiting to be exploited. Now, why this is important is because there are literally thousands and more attackers out there scanning the internet, looking for these opportunistic opportunities to jump into your environment and deploy something like ransomware. Now, to take away from this slide, Defender for Endpoint on servers and Defender for Endpoint on anything that's public facing is going to be your best bet to identifying in real time how we actually see an attacker exploit a public-facing application for the sake of deploying something like ransomware. The alerts are there. We've had really great success with detecting these. And really what you're looking for in this case is a service worker such as like IIS or Apache spawning one of these aforementioned scripting interpreters to then go and deploy an executable in some way, shape, or form. So if you're looking for some easy wins on how to actually find ransomware entering your environment, these things right here and these techniques are going to be the best way to do that, and something that we've been very successful here with at Expel. Now, going down back to our original agenda and talking about the next thing that we need to do in terms of ransomware response is optimizing the next steps. And in practice, what this looks like is we need to ask ourselves a couple of real honest questions about the capability of our responders. First and foremost, do I have the data I need to determine where else a file was executed? Let's say we have an initial lead that tells us that there's a bad file that entered our environment and is attempting to deliver something like commodity malware. Do we have the ability with the data that we're collecting right now to go determine where else in our environment that file might be executing? It's cool to identify ransomware on one host, but if we don't know that it's elsewhere in the environment, especially places that might not be monitored by EDR, we have a very serious problem that we need to deal with right in the moment. And having something like Defender for Endpoint deployed, where all that telemetry data is being built in and collected on the back end, we can start to do this really easily with something like the enterprise search inside of Defender for Endpoint. Now at the bottom here, the next question that I'd be asking is, can I easily get the metadata I need to prove what happened next on a host? Meaning if we identify that file on maybe 5 or 6 machines, we need to understand exactly what capability the attacker intended that file to have and whether or not it actually performed that capability on these hosts. 2021 has kind of proven to us that attackers aren't really interested in just deploying ransomware anymore. We see a lot of ransomware start to get deployed at the sake of something else already being in the environment. For example, Cobalt Strike. We see a lot of Cobalt Strike that comes in through malware documents, public-facing vulnerabilities, and things like that, where an attacker is actually coming in maybe days or even weeks before, poking around the environment a little bit, and then deploying ransomware where it really hurts. And if we can go identify something like Cobalt Strike really quickly and start to identify what capability the attacker actually performed through the Cobalt Strike beacon portal, we can start to see what exactly the risk is of that attacker being in the environment, and also whether or not they actually were successful in deploying something like ransomware. So all that being said, these are the two questions that we kind of ask ourselves here at Expel when we're building out a new integration. And thankfully, these are the things that are provided to us by Defender for Endpoint that make our jobs really easy when we get to the point of needing to do response for something like ransomware. Now, lastly, we talked about easily being able to perform the remediation. So once I've actually gone and identified ransomware in an environment and I figured out all of the different types of hosts that it may be on, do I have the ability at scale to go and isolate those machines or perform the following actions, such as hash banning or network blocking or credential resets. Meaning it's not really good enough in ransomware response to have someone drive over to the data center and pull the host offline. And neither is it good enough in a lot of cases for someone to go rapidly click the button, the isolate button on thousands of hosts. Like we said before, minutes are seconds and hours are minutes. We have to be really fast here. And thankfully, one of the things that Defender for Endpoint does really well is they have the ability to perform a lot of these actions through the API. So all that being said, instead of having to go click that button to isolate several hundred hosts and have someone do that as their full-time job for the next couple of hours, we can easily create a web request that goes and automatically isolates those hosts against the Defender for Endpoint API and isolates them all immediately. And when we're talking about ransomware response, this is a really important piece of the puzzle to make sure that we're not allowing the attacker to get to the really important data if they're not already there. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like again in the example that's coming up next. But really, this is probably the most important piece to take away in terms of when you're evaluating an EDR and when you're looking at the capability that you have to respond to ransomware, being able to tell that story with the data that you have access to, and then being able to do something about it. That's something that Defender for Endpoint does very, very well. Now, all that being said, we've talked a lot about Defender for Endpoint specifically, and we've talked a little bit about how we use it at Expel. But I really want to dive into an incident that we've seen here at Expel and kind of show you definitively what it looks like when we find ransomware. And what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to change over to a screen share of our staging portal of what we call Workbench at Expel. Now, Workbench at Expel, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of where we do our work. This is the product that sits on top of our MDR service. And what it's meant to be is a very transparent portal for our analysts and our SOC to communicate with you, a potential customer. Now, all that being said, everything that you see here in my version of this screen as a principal security analyst here at Expel is available to you, the customer, to see in real time. So if I come in here and I accidentally type my name wrong, or if I click the wrong button, you're going to see that as I do it and watch me go correct it very quickly. But all that to be said is that when we work at Expel and when we deal with customers and when we work through incidents, we want it to be a very hands-on experience for not just us, but for you, the customer as well. Meaning we want to work alongside your SOC because we have a lot to learn from each other. Obviously, we have well over 100 customers that we do incident response for. And the more that we can learn from your team and the more that we can actually take in that data and do something with it, makes us actually smarter at doing incident response and doing managed security. So what you're looking at here is this is actually the result of the service. This is a critical incident security incident findings report. And when we think about critical security incidents here at Expel, they're going to be for things like ransomware, for hands-on keyboard attacker, maybe for a root access key that was exposed via AWS, Azure, or GCP, things that have real significant impact for your organization that must be dealt with immediately. Now, why this report looks the way that it is because down the middle, you can see that some of the things that we do in our reporting are a little bit different that you might be used to for a traditional IR report. First and foremost, when we're dealing with real-time response, we're asking ourselves a couple of questions that we need to get the answers to. You can see here right down the middle, we have the what is it, where is it, when did it get here, how did it get here, and how did we detect it sections in our reports. The reason why we break it out this way and the reason why we answer these questions is because these are the key investigative questions that we try to answer with every single alert. And as such, we need technology that can get us the answers to those questions in a really effective amount of time. Meaning, as I'm going through this and as I find an initial alert that I'm interested in dealing with, I want to know where that alert come from. Why did it actually fire? What was the detection logic for it? And more importantly, what happened once that alert actually was triggered? Meaning on the host, something happened, what happened next? And is there anything else that the customer needs to know about after this file actually executed or after this thing happened? So all that to be said, we have a lot of work that we need to do here in real time to answer these questions. We better have technology and automation that helps us get there so that we're ready to deal with something like this in a reasonable amount of time. Now, this is obviously, like I said before, the end result of the service. How do we actually get here to be able to answer all of these questions and to be able to definitively scope something like ransomware? Well, if we jump over here to the Investigative Actions page, you're going to see something else load that's going to give you a little bit more information about actually how this works. Now, this is a real incident. There's a lot of data here that's sanitized. Normally, this lead alert would have a lot more information in it, but for the sake of our customers' confidentiality, we've pulled that out. So on the left-hand side here, you see the initial lead of what actually came into the Expel queue. You're able to see the alert with all the data there and kind of where this whole thing started. And if you notice right away, for this particular investigation, we had an initial lead for potential tool staging. Now, potential tool staging to us at Expel means that an attacker or potentially some sort of bad actor is on a host putting files in a directory that they are then going to use later for something nefarious. I kind of think of this as like kind of when a bank robber kind of, stages their, big black duffel bags outside of the door with the drills and the dynamite in it. This is the alert that lets us know that something potentially bad is about to happen. And furthermore, we also have to take a step back and realize as analysts that for someone to be able to put these tools in this directory, there's also some sort of unauthorized access to this machine that's being done by a malicious actor for them to be able to even to perform this action. So all that being said, we have two major questions that we need to answer here with this initial lead. We have a lot to work to do. So what does that look like when we start pulling more information and we start actually kicking off an investigation at Expel? Going back to the original presentation that we talked about, we need to optimize for the next steps. And some of the things that we're going to be doing to further answer this question are things like host timelining. Let's go back and see if we can get all of the process, file events, registry events, and things like that that allow us to know what happened on this host right before the alert actually happened and see if we can figure out where that attacker actually came from. But furthermore, we need to know a little bit about the capability of these files that are being written to this directory and what they do next. So all that being said, there's a lot of steps that our analysts are going to be taking next. How do you know that we're doing that? On the right-hand side of the screen over here, you can see that we actually detail all of those steps and detail the things that we do in kind of a journal type format over here so that you can follow along in our investigation. Now, what's really cool about this is as the investigation continues to go on and as we continue to use all the technology that we have access to, your team can see definitively the things that we've done on your behalf or the things that we currently are trying to answer that are more in progress. That's a really powerful thing to do in something like ransomware, where we're dealing with really quick response and we have to delegate a lot of roles between us and you, the customer. Now, why we built this way is because our end goal is to always make sure that we're optimizing the things that our analysts need to do in terms of response. And when we talk about that, that looks like investigative actions at Expel. Now, investigative actions are simply the steps that you see on the right-hand side here. And this is really where we start using Defender for Endpoint in a way that's a little bit abnormal. So what that means is when I talk about optimizing the next steps, really what I mean is that I do not want an analyst to have to worry about doing the following. I don't want them every time that they need more data to have to go and log into Defender for Endpoint, have to put in credentials, have to go and worry about running the correct query in the right pane. I don't want to have them worry about the query language that they need to go and learn and have to manipulate and deal with every query that they run. I don't want to have them go and actually worry about the format of the data that's coming back and whether that data covers the time frame that they're interested in. And I certainly don't want to have to worry about them parsing that data and having to export it in any way to then get it back into the Expel system so that we can use it. What we really want to do and where the power of Defender for Endpoint is for us and where we believe the best capability of it really is through the API. And luckily, Defender for Endpoint has done an amazing job building out every action that you can perform in the console against the API. And we've optimized ourselves to be able to take full advantage of that. So let's say going back to this alert, we want to get a really quick host timeline of what this host is actually doing. For us, it's as simple as going in here. We're going to go in and we're going to run something, let's just call it query raw logs. And you can see right here, MS Defender ATP comes up as one of the EDRs that we can use to run this query. I can go here, I can put in a quick keyword search at the bottom for something that I'm interested in, maybe a file name, maybe a username, something like that. I can put the time frame that I'm interested in. And once I hit save, this kicks off an API action that goes and runs against the Microsoft Defender API, brings back the data that we need to actually answer the question that we're interested in. It parses that data for us and it puts it back into this console so that our analysts have the data that they need right away in a format that they're expecting and can start doing analysis on that data much quicker than they could if we actually needed to continue to go back into the portal each time that we had a new question. Now, why that's really important in something like ransomware is obviously we can analyze a ton of data really quickly by having it go through our backend engine. Meaning we don't have to worry about all of this being timelined in an effective way, copying, pasting that data into a master timeline sheet, analyzing all of that. Our platform does that through the Defender ATP API integration, and we can process that data on our backend so our analysts have the things that they need right away to be able to deal with that. Now, what this further enables us to do is using that API, we can start to proactively anticipate some of the actions that our analysts might take. For example, one of the things that we've noticed very consistently across EDR investigations that we do on a day-to-day basis is that when we're dealing with this type of alert, such as like an unknown file or unknown files being written to a directory, is that our analysts are going to notice and want to do a couple of different things every single time they see this alert. First and foremost, they're going to want to know the prevalence of that action, meaning how often has that file been seen in the customer's environment? And also, how often has that file been seen across the world on the open internet? Does anyone know anything about that file? Those are very common actions that our analysts take. Next, our analysts are going to want that nice juicy timeline of all of the data that is needed to be able to answer the who, what, where, when, why questions. And what we can do, and since we've noticed those trends and have the data and metrics to back that up, is we can actually build out automatic investigative actions that run when the Defender for Endpoint alert comes into the Expel queue. So if I scroll all the way down to the bottom here, what's really cool about this alert in particular is that our automation went and looked and said, hey, I saw this alert come into the queue. I'm going to run a couple of different actions on this alert to give our analysts a little more context on this alert and some of the things that I think that they're going to need when they eventually open this alert and start to run it down. And like we talked about before, a couple of things that we know that our analysts are going to need are prevalence. And you can see right here that our robots on the back end went and noticed that, hey, this file, I actually have the file name of it, and I actually have the hash of that file as well. Let me see what I can do with that. And so it went and ran a couple of actions for us that actually became very significant in this investigation without an analyst even needing to move a finger. So what it told us was that, hey, this file, one of the files that was being written to that directory, over the past 7 days, I've seen this file on 6 unique hosts. Now, 6 unique hosts might seem like a lot, but at this particular customer, they have 125,000 endpoints that we're protecting. So 6 out of 125,000 is actually a very small percentage. And one other thing the automation noticed was that all of the executions of this file started within the last hour, meaning this is a recent file that entered the environment, it's on a low number of hosts, and it's triggering an alert. That kind of raises my suspicions as an analyst and something I want to dig into a little bit more. Now, another thing that our automation did for us right away before we even asked for it was, hey, since I have the hash for that file, let's go look it up in something like VirusTotal and see what comes back. And our automation noticed that not only was the prevalence low for that file, but when we went and looked it up globally and saw that it did come actually back with a VirusTotal match, this actually matches a known sample of Dharma ransomware. Meaning that when this investigation kicked off at 3 in the morning on a Saturday, which is when it really did in real time, this was escalated to our senior team. And at the time, I was the analyst on call that responded to this. And as I opened my eyes at 3 in the morning and started to read what was going on here, it took me all about 15 seconds to go from, hey, we have potential tool staging an environment, to noticing through the power of Defender for Endpoint that we have ransomware on 6 hosts. And obviously, as you can imagine, and as we start figuring out what the next steps are for this investigation, the steps for a suspicious file being in the environment versus the response that's needed for ransomware is much different and allows us to be a lot more pointed and allows us to be a lot more on alert for how we need to respond next in terms of telling our customer what to do. So this is kind of what proactively looking for the next steps looks like, and building out that automation with the power of Defender for Endpoint to be able to power your analysts to make really smart decisions with the data that they already have. We've gone ahead and done that in the Expel Workbench because we believe that this is the most powerful way in which we can get our analysts to that decision point a lot faster. Meaning when this alert came in, we knew kind of what it was, but we didn't have all of the detail that we needed to make an appropriate decision of what to do next. That decision support and that decision point, the closer we can get to making that in real time, the better our response time is going to be, the better that we're going to be able to do in recommending isolation, and the faster we're going to be able to eradicate this malware out of the environment. This is where Defender for Endpoint helps us a lot. And all of the actions that we can build out for Defender for Endpoint from this investigative actions capability through the API is what allows us to move insanely quick in being able to deal with this type of threat. So what happens next? Obviously, we know that there's ransomware in the environment. We know that we have it on 6 machines potentially. At least that file exists on 6 machines. We have a couple of additional questions that we need to go answer really quickly to know what to do next. First and foremost, I need to know everywhere that that file executed in the environment, and I need to know whether it's resident on disk or whether we have a successful process execution of that to know what the appropriate next steps are. For example, you can see over here, one of the first things that we did when we worked with this customer to deal with this ransomware threat is we recommended isolation of these hosts while we were confirming the execution. Now, as you can see, some of these were actually domain controllers and web servers that our customer was seeing this ransomware on. And obviously that added a little bit of sensitivity to this issue as well, because we're dealing with ransomware on really sensitive machines. So all that being said, we need to move really quickly to determine whether or not these really high risk machines actually are being encrypted or if they're just being targeted by this attacker. So again, through the power of the automation that we have and through the power of the things that we can do through the Defender for Endpoint API, we can start to go and timeline these 6 machines that you can see here really quickly to understand what's going on. Now, in my career as a forensic analyst, timelining a machine is a very tedious process. Going and having to collect all the forensic artifacts you need, going and actually querying the EDR, bringing back that data and making sense of it in a timeline format, can be very cumbersome. But with all the things that we've proactively done to be quick here, we were able to timeline these 6 machines in under 30 minutes. Meaning we could say definitively within the 10 minutes that this alert happened, what was going on these 6 machines and having a master timeline built out for what the attack was actually looking like and what the risk was of that malware being in the environment. So all that being said, we were able to confirm that these files actually executed on these 6 machines, and we needed to isolate these hosts immediately, even though they were really sensitive machines to the customer. Now, all that being said, the next couple of steps here that we need to do are we need to collect and identify all the different sources of the malware that we can see in the environment. And going back to that scoping and going back to that timelining, we actually saw that there were 3 different variants of this malware that were attempted to be put on these machines across the environment. We need to figure out where else those are, and we certainly need to block them in real time to make sure that as they get put on new machines, they're not allowed to execute. We can, again, do that very easily through the API integration. We can ask a couple of questions and we can get those answers very quickly, which allowed us to determine that these 3 strains were the most prevalent and the ones that were commonly being executed by the attacker. Now, one of the cool things that you'll see here in these remediation actions that's a little bit non-standard for something like ransomware response is you'll see here that there's actually a reset credential action that we gave to our customer. Now, when we're dealing with something like ransomware, there's obviously the immediate response of what's needed to be done to stop the ransomware. And we kind of talked through what that looks like with Defender for Endpoint and all the things that are needed. But one of the really powerful things to having the telemetry and the capability that Defender for Endpoint has when we're dealing with something like ransomware is the ability to go ask some of the broader questions of, hey, how did we actually get attacked? How did this actually get here? And one of the cool things that we were able to identify really quickly through the timelining of those 6 hosts was that Defender for Endpoint actually has an additional capability that was very helpful to us here. We can do something called acquire a triage package. And acquiring a triage package in the Defender for Endpoint console is very easy. It's a click of a button. It goes and runs a few PowerShell scripts on the box that collect things like event logs, shim cache, am cache, and a lot of the forensic capability that you're used to dealing with when you're timelining a Windows machine. Now, what's cool about that is that's also an action that's available through the API itself and that we can automate in our collection of forensics at Expel. So as this kicked off and as we went and gathered these timelines, the other thing that we did was we brought back those forensic artifacts in real time and started to timeline things like event logs that gave us a little bit further visibility into how this malware was actually being placed on disk. And specifically for 3 of the 6 hosts that you see here, 3 of these were actually publicly available to the open internet. And in specifically, they actually had RDP open to the public internet as well, that was allowing the attacker to actually authenticate with a brute force credential, the one that you see listed here, to authenticate via RDP and then have basic access to the box to be able to start staging the files that we were originally alerted to. So what this looked like when we went through this part of the investigation was we brought back that triage package. We opened it up. We took all of the forensics out of it. We dumped it into our master timeline, and we started correlating the time that we saw these suspicious authentications happening against the times that we actually saw the malware running on the host. And we were able to determine pretty definitively that this credential was being used by the attacker and was also part of a brute force attack that was done on these 3 machines within the next 20 minutes of our investigation. So all that being said, that triage package ability to be able to go and get those forensics is a really integral part of the way in which we're able to answer in real time how this happened and what happened next. So going a little bit deeper here and kind of wrapping up this investigation, one of the last things that we're going to attempt to do is kind of understand exactly to a T what happened here in terms of how to get here. We know that there was open RDP. We know that this happened, but who is the person that's trying to put these files on this machine? What type of attack are we dealing with here? Is this more of a targeted ransomware attack, or is this something that's more opportunistic in nature and something that might have been done just kind of willy-nilly as the vulnerability existed on these machines? So through some of the data that we were able to pull from Defender for Endpoint and through some additional enrichment that we have with specifically the service Gray Noise, which I highly recommend if you're not using this already, we were actually able to pull out the IP addresses that we saw the RDP authentications coming from and the brute force attempts coming from. And through the power of Gray Noise specifically, putting it back into that platform, we could identify the 3 IP addresses that were being used for brute force to understand that these are common RDP scanners that are opportunistically scanning the internet. And lastly, this IP address that we see down here, this was the IP address that was actually used by the attacker to perform the authentications when the files were being put on the box. And when we ran that through Gray Noise, nothing came back. It's not an opportunistic scanner, but aligns more with the theory that someone was manually attempting to propagate this malware, which is really interesting. So all that being said, within the next couple of minutes of pulling back that data, we can answer in real time that this looks something more opportunistic and isn't targeted against this specific organization. So with that all being said, start to finish, starting at 3 in the morning and kind of working our way till about 4:30 in the morning, we had complete answers for this entire attack with remediation and with being able to deal with some of the minutia of blocking and isolating hosts, blocking bad hashes and all of those types of things in 90 minutes, which is an excellent response time for something like ransomware to be able to all go back to bed on a Saturday morning and have this thing completely mitigated with all of the major questions answered for us. Now, down at the bottom here, you'll notice something that's part of a lot of our reports here at Expel, and it's definitely relevant when we talk about ransomware response. We include something that's automatically generated in all of our reports here called the alert to fix timeline. And the alert to fix timeline is something that is auto-generated on the back end of Expel that reads the timestamps of alerts and major actions that are done on an investigation as it flows through the system. You can see here we have the time where the initial alert came into the queue. We have the time 8 minutes later when this actually was picked up by an analyst at Expel and starting to become worked. And then down here, we have the time that this actually was promoted to an incident when we realized, oh, there's ransomware going on here, and the time in which it took us to actually assign the first remediation action. Now, this being a staging example, this isn't the real response time. 4 hours is not an acceptable response time to ransomware. But in reality, the deliverable that we gave to our customer, this said 18 minutes. So 18 minutes from us initially getting the lead from the Microsoft Defender ATP to us actually actioning that lead and being able to answer some of those basic investigative questions is a huge advantage over having to do all of this manually, where some of those actions may take hours to actually go and perform and be able to make sense of the data that's needed to actually answer those definitively. So with that all being said, that's kind of how we think about ransomware response here at Expel. That's some of the ways in which we use Defender for Endpoint specifically in terms of the things that we look for in a really good integration partner, as well as some of the capability that we believe makes a really great EDR that can deal with the most advanced and some of the most relevant threats that you're going to see as an organization. We love Defender for Endpoint. It's one of our favorite EDRs here at Expel, and allows us to do really cool things like this ransomware example that I just showed you. So all that being said, I want to stop here really quickly and answer any questions that you might have. If you do have questions, feel free to just drop them into the chat and I'll read them aloud and answer them in real time. Awesome. I see in the chat we have a couple of questions that rolled in. I'm going to read the first one right aloud here. It says, any other activity we should look out for, like potential tool staging, that should sound the alarms that something bad is about to happen? That being said, I want to go back actually into my slides and go back to a specific slide that shows some data to support what I'm about to say. Really, when we're looking at ransomware and when we're looking at something like leads that kind of we deal with commonly that look like ransomware, these are going to be some of the things that you're going to want to make sure that your analysts are being made aware of. And what this really looks like in practice, I've talked a little bit about this earlier in the presentation, but we want to look at these specific MITRE attack techniques. This is real data from across our customers on kind of what we've seen over the last quarter in terms of ransomware deployment. And you'll notice here that a lot of these techniques actually overlap with common commodity malware techniques that someone is using to deploy commodity malware in your environment. The one big thing that differs from that is I would highly recommend looking at public-facing applications in your organization. One of the things that we recommend to all of our customers to do on a regular basis is to use a service like Shodan, and just using Shodan really quickly to go and look at the data that's available to yourself and also an attacker of what applications are being made available on your corporate network and what versions of those applications that are running. Too often do we see that someone actually has OpenRDP exposed to the internet, or maybe an old version of Apache or WordPress or something like that, that eventually is exploited through an RCE and used to deploy ransomware. If I could recommend doing that, that would probably be my top priority. And then looking at the alerting that your SOC is currently doing and looking at how these things are being prioritized in terms of the things that analysts are looking for. We see a lot of HTA files, a lot of JavaScript and unmanaged PowerShell being used to remotely download a file and execute it on a machine. And more importantly, the classic things that have always existed still are alive and well in 2021, but Microsoft Office documents and macros in your environment are going to be some of the leading ways in which an attacker is going to try to fool some of your staff into running something that they shouldn't. So if I could make any recommendations, they're all listed here in things that are really high fidelity alerts for us into kind of how ransomware may be deployed in your environment. The next question I see come in, any tips for how to get started when you're thinking about optimizing Defender for your security needs? That's a really great question. One of the things that I would highly recommend is thinking about how you can not only use Defender for doing detection, but how you can use Defender for response. The reason why we love Defender so much and the reason why we kind of, continue to build out our integration is because all of the capability of Defender for Endpoint has API actions. And I would really take a look at that API and start thinking of ways that you can further enable your SOC or your responders to get the data that they need quickly through that API integration, and how we can use that API to start automating some of the parts of your response. Specifically, when we're thinking about something like ransomware and how we can further our response capability there, are there easy, quick wins that you could do with some technology in your environment that allow you to isolate hosts or perform remediation quicker than someone doing it manually? And then working back from that to say, are there actions that I can give to my analysts that they're commonly performing that we can automate away for them so they can get to that decision point really, really quick? That's how we think about it at Expel, and that's kind of the journey we've been on with Defender for Endpoint that's been very fruitful for us. Yeah, so final question. Can you highlight some of the prerequisites for using ransomware piece for Defender? I think some of the things that we think about when we're thinking about how to set ourselves up for success for ransomware and Defender is really kind of dealing with a threat like ransomware is something where you have to be fast. And Defender for Endpoint allows you to be really fast if you're enabling your analysts in the right way. And one of the things that I think is really important about using Defender for ransomware response is all of the ability you have to respond with Defender that's configurable. Defender does a really good job in its response part of its platform to allowing you to identify specifically the way that you want to isolate a host and what applications you want to actually make available to the person whose host is being isolated. Some of our favorite capability about that whole response process that I didn't even touch on in this presentation today is there's actually some really cool things that you can do with isolation in itself, where you're not exactly taking the entire host offline, but you're only allowing it to perform specific functions. There's a lot of configurability there, and there's a lot of cool things that you can do to set yourself up for success when you actually need to go ahead and isolate a machine. And the last thing that I'll leave you with in terms of ransomware response, that's number one at the priority of how we respond here and what we recommend to our customers, is test your incident response plan. It's cool to have one. It's better to test it and make sure that it actually works before you actually need to go and do it. So with all that being said, really appreciate you having you all here today. It's been fun presenting to you all. Enjoy the rest of Detection Day. And until then, I will talk to you soon. Thanks for coming.